Welcome to the deep dive. We are really thrilled you could join us today because we have a mission, and it's one that requires us to act a bit like, investigative journalists.
Exactly. Today we are opening up this sprawling and honestly highly controversial dossier. It's known as the Einstein-Velikovsky files.
The suppressed history of our solar system. And I
Yeah.
just have to tell you, the stack of source materials sitting right in front of us is, well, it's unlike anything we've tackled before.
It really is.
Mhm.
We are looking at a bizarre and incredibly fascinating collection of documents today.
Right.
We've got these really dense, recently translated Portuguese research summaries that they completely cross-reference global mythology.
Well, yeah, and we also have extensive autobiographical texts, really deeply personal handwritten letters.
And the raw, unedited transcripts from some highly contentious scientific symposiums.
All of this material documents the life, the radical theories, and the intense, bitter battles of a man named Immanuel Velikovsky.
And Velikovsky is a figure who defies easy categorization. I mean, he was a medical doctor and a psychoanalyst by trade.
Right.
But he stepped entirely outside of his professional lane to challenge the absolute bedrock foundations of astronomy, geology, and ancient history.
We aren't just talking about a minor disagreement over a date or a single planetary observation.
No, he proposed a unified theory that rewrote the cosmos.
Which is why I want to set the scene for you right away, using an image pulled directly from these autobiographical texts. It is an image that is just incredible to picture and honestly a little haunting. Imagine Albert Einstein, universally recognized as one of history's greatest, most celebrated minds.
The father of modern physics.
Right. He's passing away in a hospital in Princeton in April 1955, and there, left open on his desk, exactly where he had been reading it in his final hours, is a highly controversial, heavily suppressed book.
Worlds in Collision.
By Immanuel Velikovsky. Okay, let's unpack this. Why on earth was the father of modern physics spending his final precious days reading a book that the rest of the scientific establishment was actively trying to ban?
It is a phenomenal image to start with, and it perfectly frames our analytical approach for this entire deep dive. Because what we were looking at today isn't just about cosmic history or ancient mythology or planetary physics.
Right.
It is a profound and sometimes uncomfortable look into the sociology of science. It is the ultimate case study of what happens when an absolute outsider walks into the room and challenges the established dogmas of the scientific elite.
Velikovsky didn't just propose a new idea, he proposed a radical rewriting of everything we thought we knew about the universe and human history.
And by looking at his private correspondence with Einstein, we get a front-row seat to an unprecedented clash between a heretic and a genius.
Let's jump right into that clash because it really forms the emotional and intellectual core of these sources. We are in Princeton, New Jersey.
The years are roughly 1952 to 1955.
Now, the autobiographical texts note that Velikovsky and Einstein, they weren't strangers. They actually first met decades earlier.
Back in the 1920s in Berlin, they worked together on establishing a scientific journal for the University of Jerusalem.
But they reconnected deeply in Princeton, and the descriptions of these meetings are incredibly vivid.
You can picture it perfectly. Velikovsky describes walking into Einstein's modest home on Mercer Street.
Walking up this steep staircase past walls, just absolutely groaning with books.
And Einstein comes down, greets him warmly, and offers him a seat in his high-backed, heavily upholstered chair.
Einstein jokingly called it his Jupiter chair.
The Jupiter chair. I love that detail.
It's in this room, sitting in the Jupiter chair, that Velikovsky initiates a relentless, years-long intellectual debate with Einstein.
The central scientific clash between them comes down to a battle of two fundamental forces: gravitation versus electromagnetism.
Exactly. And to truly understand the gravity of this debate, and I promise that is the only physics pun I'll make today.
I'll hold you to that. But seriously, we have to look at the mainstream celestial mechanics of the time, which these sources refer to as the Newtonian or Laplacian model.
Right. For hundreds of years, astronomers had perfected their mathematical models based on one foundational, unquestioned assumption.
That the planets, the moons, the sun, they all move through the empty vacuum of space, governed only by gravity and inertia.
The universe was viewed as a giant, incredibly precise clockwork mechanism.
Newton's math works beautifully if planets are just heavy, neutral rocks floating in a void.
But Velikovsky dared to walk into Einstein's study and claim that this bedrock assumption was fundamentally wrong.
Which is mind-blowing.
Wait, let me stop you there because I want to make sure we are representing you, the skeptical listener here. Velikovsky is a psychoanalyst.
A psychoanalyst, yes.
Why on earth did Einstein, the greatest physicist of the century, even let a psychoanalyst into his living room to debate orbital mechanics. Why didn't he just politely show him the door?
That is the crucial question, and the letters reveal the answer. Velikovsky wasn't just a crank shouting on a street corner.
Right.
He was a polymath. He spoke multiple languages, he had an encyclopedic command of ancient texts, and his arguments were meticulously structured.
Einstein was fascinated by Velikovsky's mind, even if he vehemently disagreed with his physics.
Velikovsky proposed what we might call an electric universe.
He argued that celestial bodies, the sun, the planets, the comets, are not electrically neutral.
They carry massive electrical charges, and electromagnetic fields play a massive, unacknowledged role in planetary motion.
And looking at the transcripts of their conversations, Velikovsky didn't just casually suggest this. He brought receipts.
He really did. He read directly from the epilogue of his own manuscript, pointing out things to Einstein that seem incredibly obvious to us now, but were actively ignored in celestial mechanics back in the early 1950s.
He noted that the sun has a general magnetic field.
Solar spots are intensely magnetic,
The Earth itself is a giant magnet.
and cosmic rays are charged particles.
He basically looked Einstein in the eye and asked a simple question. If the universe is absolutely swimming in electromagnetism, why are the massive planets entirely exempt from it?
What's fascinating here is why this was so deeply heretical, and why Einstein fought back so hard in his margin notes.
Because if you introduce electromagnetism into celestial mechanics, you threaten to shatter centuries of perfectly calculated gravitational math.
Take Kepler's third law, for instance, which was the holy grail of orbital mechanics.
It basically dictates that a planet's orbital period is strictly tied to its distance from the sun.
A beautiful, elegant equation based purely on mass and gravity.
But if you add electromagnetic forces,
Imagine two giant magnets either pushing apart or pulling together.
that distance changes, the math breaks, the clockwork shatters.
Einstein himself had used a tiny, unexplained anomaly in the orbit of Mercury, a deviation of just 43 seconds of arc per century.
He used that to prove his general theory of relativity.
So Velikovsky was essentially asking the Grandmaster, did you ever consider if that tiny anomaly was caused by the sun's magnetic field interacting with Mercury's charge?
To admit that electromagnetic forces were at play meant that orbits could be drastically altered in unpredictable ways.
Velikovsky knew exactly who he was debating, so he laid a trap.
We see this brilliantly executed in their handwritten letters from 1954. He uses what he calls the comet grazing the sun argument.
It's a thought experiment designed to corner Einstein.
Velikovsky writes, and I'm paraphrasing the translation here, he says if a comet, which we know has electromagnetic properties in its tail, passes directly through the highly charged corona of the sun, wouldn't it experience some kind of electromagnetic effect?
Wouldn't its orbit be altered by something other than just pure gravity?
It was a masterful chess move.
Because if Einstein conceded that a comet experiences electromagnetic forces when it gets near the sun, then Velikovsky's next logical step is obvious.
Well, what about when the comet is a little further away?
And what about the actual planets that travel through that exact same space?
You can see the tension in the archival sources. Einstein's marginal notes furiously push back against this.
He relied heavily on that pure Newtonian math. He wrote back that if the sun and planets were highly charged, they would repel each other.
And Kepler's laws of planetary motion would simply cease to function.
There is a very famous letter from Einstein to Velikovsky in May 1954, where Einstein lays out his stance with incredible clarity.
He writes a phrase that becomes central to this whole dossier.
Catastrophes, yes. Venus, no.
Let's break down what he meant by that, because it is a crucial distinction.
Einstein had read Velikovsky's historical manuscripts, and surprisingly, he actually agreed with him that the Earth had suffered massive global catastrophes in the ancient past.
He recognized the sheer volume of geological and historical evidence Velikovsky had compiled from these Portuguese summaries of global myths.
But he fiercely, categorically rejected Velikovsky's celestial mechanics.
He refused to believe that the planet Venus had anything to do with these catastrophes, or that the orbits of planets could change so wildly.
Right, because Einstein, along with the entire astronomical establishment, believed the solar system had been a stable, predictable clockwork for millions of years.
But Velikovsky was nothing if not stubborn. He absolutely refused to back down from this electric universe model.
And this stubborn, relentless debate between these two men led Velikovsky to make a prediction.
An impossible prediction that he put in writing, challenging Einstein directly.
A prediction that would eventually shake the entire scientific world to its core.
Which brings us to what the sources highlight as the ultimate smoking gun of this entire affair: the whispers from Jupiter.
Let's look at the timeline here because it reads like a thriller.
In October 1953, Velikovsky is invited to give a lecture at the Princeton Graduate College Forum.
He stands up and makes a daring, highly specific, and frankly completely absurd prediction by the standards of the day.
At the time, conventional astronomy confidently stated that Jupiter was a dead, cold, ice-covered planet.
Just a frozen ball of gas far from the sun.
But Velikovsky, basing his logic on his reading of ancient mythological texts and his heretical electromagnetic theories, claimed that Jupiter was an electrically charged dark star.
He claimed it had gases in violent motion.
And he predicted on the record that Jupiter would emit radio noises.
We really need to ground you in just how wild a claim this was in 1953.
Radio astronomy was barely in its infancy.
Most astronomers were still just looking through optical telescopes. Nobody, literally nobody, was pointing radio antennas at the planets.
Why would they? Under the strict gravitational model, there was absolutely zero reason a frozen, inert ball of gas and ice like Jupiter would broadcast radio waves.
It would be like expecting a snowball to emit a Wi-Fi signal.
But Velikovsky was so confident in his model that in June 1954, he explicitly challenges Einstein in a letter.
I want to read a piece of this because the tone is just incredible.
He writes, "Of course I am a heretic, but does Jupiter send radio noises or not? This can easily be found if you should wish."
He's basically daring Einstein to prove him wrong.
And Einstein's reaction.
He dismissed it entirely.
He wrote a note in the margins of that letter basically saying this wouldn't be a valid test of anything.
Because he firmly believed down to his bones that celestial bodies were electrically neutral.
He didn't even think it was worth the telescope time to check.
But then we fast forward to April 1955.
And I just keep picturing this moment in my head. The American Astronomical Society is holding a major meeting right there in Princeton.
Two scientists from the Carnegie Institution, Bernard Burke and Kenneth Franklin, stand up to present a paper.
Now, they hadn't been looking for Jupiter.
They were using a new radio array to study the Crab Nebula.
But for weeks, they kept picking up this massive, sweeping interference.
At first, they literally thought it was a passing farm tractor, or maybe a localized thunderstorm.
But then they realized the interference was tracking with sidereal time.
Meaning it was moving with the stars.
They pinpointed the source. It was Jupiter.
They announced the accidental discovery of strong, burst-like radio emissions coming from this supposedly dead, cold planet.
The scientific community sitting in that room was utterly shocked.
They had no theoretical framework to explain it.
But Velikovsky did.
The dramatic timing of what happens next is almost unbelievable.
Velikovsky sees the announcement of Burke and Franklin's discovery in the New York Times on April 6th.
He immediately contacts Einstein's secretary, Helen Dukas.
And he brings this news, this undeniable proof of his impossible prediction, directly to Einstein's house on April 8th.
This is just 9 days before Albert Einstein dies.
It is a profound historical moment. Velikovsky lays the evidence on the table.
And here we see the true mark of Einstein's genius. A lesser mind would have dug their heels in, made excuses, or claimed it was a coincidence.
But Einstein possessed a profound willingness to pivot in the face of empirical evidence.
He concedes. He looks at this psychoanalyst, this man he had been arguing with for years, and he realizes Velikovsky was right.
Einstein tells Velikovsky, and this is documented by Helen Dukas, I have again read In Worlds in Collision. It is a book of immeasurable importance, and scientists should read it.
That is a massive tectonic shift from his earlier dismissals.
It is. Now, to be analytically rigorous, we must note that even in that last meeting, Einstein still debated the mechanics.
He was still trying to find a purely gravitational explanation for how the solar system could have stabilized after a catastrophe.
But he recognized the undeniable predictive power of Velikovsky's work.
He realized that a theory, no matter how heretical, that can predict the unknown radio emissions of a distant planet deserves to be taken seriously.
And what's wild is that the sources show this wasn't an isolated lucky guess.
Velikovsky made several other claims that completely contradicted the mainstream science of the 1950s, but were later unequivocally proven true by the dawn of the space age.
Let's look at those because they are staggering. For instance, Velikovsky predicted that the planet Venus would be incandescently hot.
In the 1950s, astronomers believed Venus was basically a swampy tropical version of Earth, maybe slightly warmer because it was closer to the sun.
Velikovsky said no. It recently underwent a massive catastrophic event. It will be boiling hot.
Decades later, the Mariner, the second space probe, reaches Venus and confirms a surface temperature of over 400 degrees Celsius.
He also predicted that the Earth's magnetic field extended far out into space all the way to the moon.
Astronomers laughed at that. Then the Van Allen radiation belts were discovered, proving him right.
He predicted Venus would have a massive, crushing atmosphere, which was also proven true by Soviet Venera probes.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it forces us, and you, the listener, to ask a profound question.
How did a man studying ancient history, mythology, and psychology make incredibly accurate astrophysical predictions decades before space probes even existed?
To answer that, we have to look away from the telescopes and look at the texts.
We have to understand why Velikovsky believed Jupiter was charged and Venus was hot.
We have to dive into the violent cosmic drama he believed birthed our current solar system.
This takes us right into the heart of his most famous and most vilified book, Worlds in Collision.
And I have to say, reading through the summaries of his central thesis, it is terrifying.
He argued that our solar system is not a peaceful clockwork mechanism that has been quietly ticking away for billions of years.
Instead, he claimed it was the site of recent, incredibly violent catastrophes.
And the most shocking part, he claimed these planetary collisions were actually witnessed, survived, and recorded by human beings.
The entire core of this catastrophic theory revolves around the planet Venus.
Velikovsky utilized those Portuguese research summaries we mentioned earlier, which were essentially massive translation dossiers of global mythology.
He analyzed texts from the Americas, the Mayan Dresden Codex texts from China, from India, from Egypt, like the Ipuwer Papyrus.
And the Babylonian Venus tablets of Emisaduqa.
And he found a deeply unsettling pattern, a recurring global terror associated specifically with the planet Venus.
He concluded that Venus was not originally a planet in its current stable orbit.
He proposed something that made astronomers' heads spin. He claimed that Venus was originally a massive comet that was violently expelled from the giant planet Jupiter.
Right. And he claimed that around 1500 BC, which in geological terms is literally yesterday, just 3,500 years ago, this newly born cometary Venus entered the inner solar system and passed terrifyingly close to Earth.
And he is very clear that this wasn't just a pretty meteor shower or a light show in the sky.
Velikovsky claimed this near miss was the actual physical cause behind the plagues of the biblical Exodus, the parting of the Red Sea, and the sudden, mysterious collapse of the Middle Kingdom in Egypt.
The physical consequences he describes from this near miss are apocalyptic.
He argued that the immense electromagnetic and gravitational interaction between the Earth and the massive comet Venus caused the Earth's axis to physically shift.
And even temporarily inverted the geographic poles.
Let's pause and think about the physics of that for a second. If the Earth's crust shifts or the rotation slows down due to electromagnetic drag, what happens to the oceans?
You would have global hurricanes of unimaginable force. The oceans would literally slosh over the continents, creating massive tidal waves miles high.
You would have volcanic eruptions and seismic activity on a scale that would fracture the Earth's crust.
Velikovsky used this exact mechanism to explain ancient records from across the globe that described the sun appearing to stand still in the sky.
Like in the biblical story of Joshua.
Or myths from other cultures describing the sun rising in the west and setting in the east.
He attributed these not to wild imaginations, but to actual temporary changes in the Earth's rotation and axial tilt caused by the comet's electromagnetic drag.
One of the details in the sources that I found genuinely fascinating, that shows how he blended chemistry with theology, is how he explains the mystery of manna.
According to the biblical account, manna fell from the sky to feed the Israelites as they wandered in the desert after the Exodus.
Traditionally, this is viewed as a divine magical miracle.
Velikovsky didn't view it as magic at all. He viewed it as a physical chemical event.
Yes, and the explanation is incredibly grounded. He proposed that the comet Venus, like many comets, had a tail rich in hydrocarbons.
Essentially crude oil vapor petroleum gases.
As Earth passed directly through the comet's tail, these hydrocarbons precipitated into our atmosphere.
To give you a way to visualize this, think of the comet's tail like a massive cloud of crude oil vapor.
Velikovsky argued that when this vapor interacted with Earth's atmosphere, combined with the intense heat and electrical discharges of the near miss, the atmosphere basically acted like a giant petrochemical plant.
It synthesized those hydrocarbons into edible carbohydrates that precipitated out of the sky.
He argued that the manna was a literal organic synthesis.
It is an incredible synthesis of atmospheric chemistry and ancient text.
And according to his timeline, the cosmic chaos didn't stop with Venus?
Velikovsky outlined a second wave of catastrophes occurring centuries later, roughly in the 8th century BC.
He argued that Venus eventually settled into its current, more circular orbit. But in doing so, its massive gravitational and electromagnetic wake displaced the planet Mars.
And then Mars becomes a problem. He claims Mars made a series of close approaches to Earth.
These Martian encounters, according to Velikovsky, altered the global climate, caused further seismic upheaval, and actually changed the length of the year.
This is a point where his use of global historical records is particularly compelling.
He points out that if you look at the oldest records of almost all ancient cultures, the Mayans with their Hab calendar, the Incas, the Chinese, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the early Romans,
They all originally used calendars of exactly 360 days, 12 months of exactly 30 days each.
they didn't have intercalary months or leap years.
And mainstream historians usually say, well, they were just bad at math or they liked the round number 360. And eventually they figured out this solar year is 365 and a quarter days.
But Velikovsky argues that's an incredibly arrogant view of ancient astronomers who were meticulous observers of the sky.
He argues they weren't bad at math at all. The calendars were exactly 360 days because the Earth's orbit literally took exactly 360 days to complete.
It wasn't until the Martian near misses in the 8th century BC pushed Earth into a slightly wider orbit that our year extended.
And he notes that right around that time in history, you see all these disparate cultures simultaneously instituting 5 epigomenal or unlucky days at the end of their calendars to make up the new 365-day year.
It's a breathtaking extrapolation. By connecting global mythology with physical planetary events, Velikovsky provided a framework where ancient myths were not just psychological allegories or fairy tales invented around a campfire.
They were empirical observations of the sky recorded by deeply traumatized survivors.
It fundamentally changes how you read mythology. Why did almost every ancient culture, completely independent of one another, worship Jupiter as the supreme deity?
Velikovsky argued it was a collective inherited human memory of Jupiter's terrifying dominance in the sky and its explosive birthing of the comet Venus.
Take Greek mythology. The goddess Athena, who was explicitly associated with the morning star Venus, was said to be born fully armed and shouting from the head of Zeus,
who represents the planet Jupiter.
Mainstream scholars view this as a poetic, strange invention. Velikovsky saw it as a literal physical description of a cosmic event handed down through generations.
But this brings us to a massive roadblock.
If this narrative aligns global mythology with physical evidence so neatly, why did mainstream historians and archaeologists reject it just as fiercely as the astronomers did?
The answer is that accepting Velikovsky's theory required tearing down the entire accepted timeline of human history.
Which leads us into our next major investigation, the chronology conspiracy, or the 800-year error.
This is where we see Velikovsky transition from a cosmologist to a historical detective.
In his subsequent book, Ages in Chaos, and a later heavily suppressed unpublished manuscript called The Dark Age of Greece, Velikovsky identified what he believed was a massive, fatal flaw in our understanding of the past.
A 600 to 800-year discrepancy in conventional Egyptian chronology.
To understand why this matters to you, the listener, we have to explain how ancient history is dated.
In the study of the ancient Mediterranean and Near East Egypt is the anchor.
The timelines of ancient Greece, Assyria, Babylon, and Judea are all largely dated based on when those cultures interacted with specific Egyptian pharaohs.
Precisely. Egyptian chronology is the yardstick by which all other ancient civilizations are measured.
So if the Egyptian timeline is wrong, if it is artificially stretched, then everything else, the history of Greece, the history of the Bible, is completely wrong.
Velikovsky claimed that mainstream historians had literally invented centuries of history that never actually happened, merely to cover up the fact that Egyptian timelines did not match biblical timelines or Greek archaeological records.
She specifically targeted something called the Greek Dark Ages.
For the listener who might not be familiar, mainstream history says that after the brilliant Mycenaean civilization in Greece, the era of the Trojan War, there is a sudden, mysterious 500-year gap in the archaeological record.
Writing like the linear B script just vanishes. Advanced pottery stops. Major building ceases.
It's an archaeological black hole until the sudden rise of classical Greece.
And why do historians believe in this 500-year black hole? Because they dated Mycenaean artifacts based on Egyptian scarabs found alongside them.
Since the Egyptian timeline was stretched out, it forced historians to insert a 500-year gap in Greek history to make the dates align with the eventual emergence of classical Greece.
Velikovsky said this is absurd. He argued there was no Dark Age. The gap only exists on paper.
The Mycenaean civilization collapsed, and classical Greece emerged shortly after. The 500 years of darkness were an illusion caused by a flawed Egyptian anchor.
By realigning the timelines, by essentially closing that 800-year gap and sliding Egyptian history forward in time, Velikovsky created shocking new historical synchronisms.
He argued that famous historical figures, who historians thought lived centuries apart and had different names and different cultures, were actually the exact same people interacting with each other.
The examples he provides in the sources are fascinating. For instance, he proposed that the powerful Egyptian pharaoh Thutmose III, who conquered much of the Near East, was actually the exact same person as the biblical king Shishak.
Who famously sacked Solomon's temple in Jerusalem.
Under the conventional timeline, they are centuries apart. Under Velikovsky's revised timeline, their military campaigns match up perfectly city by conquered city.
He didn't stop there. He claimed that the legendary female pharaoh Queen Hatshepsut of Egypt, who mounted a famous expedition to the land of Punt, was actually the Queen of Sheba who visited King Solomon.
He argued that Punt was simply the Egyptian name for Solomon's Judea.
Furthermore, he claimed the mysterious Hyksos invaders who brutally conquered Egypt without warning were the Amalekites from the biblical narrative who encountered the Israelites wandering in the desert.
By sliding the timeline 800 years forward, suddenly the fragmented archaeological records of Egypt perfectly matched the historical records of the Hebrews.
But of course, a theory this radical, bringing us to a massive timeline shift, conflicts with modern scientific dating methods.
Specifically, radiocarbon dating, or carbon-14, which was being developed right around the time Velikovsky was publishing.
You would think that the invention of C14 dating would easily settle this debate once and for all. Just test the artifacts right.
But Velikovsky looked at the early results and called the application of it an absolute farce.
He didn't just disagree with the results, he explosively accused major museums and laboratories of actively suppressing, ignoring, or misinterpreting radiocarbon results that confirmed his revised timeline.
To be fair to Velikovsky's skepticism, we have to explain how C14 dating worked in the early 1950s.
Willard Libby invented the method, but the original technique involved reducing an organic sample to solid carbon soot.
Painting that soot onto the inside of a cylinder and putting it in a Geiger counter.
This solid carbon method was incredibly susceptible to environmental contamination.
A tiny bit of museum dust or fallout from the atmospheric nuclear testing happening at the time could wildly skew the dates.
The sources mention a very specific high-profile example that Velikovsky zeroed in on.
He pointed to tests done on organic materials from the tomb of the famous boy king Tutankhamun.
Conventional history puts King Tut way back in the 14th century BC.
But Velikovsky alleged that when the labs ran the radiocarbon tests on artifacts from the tomb, the results didn't point to the 14th century.
They pointed to the 9th century BC rather than much earlier, perfectly aligning with Velikovsky's shortened timeline.
And according to Velikovsky, the establishment quietly buried those results because they contradicted the accepted dogma.
And he reinterpreted other bizarre ancient mysteries through this new lens of advanced forgotten knowledge and catastrophic upheaval.
For example, ancient Hebrew lore speaks of something called the Shamir.
Legend says it was a magical worm that could cut through solid stone, which King Solomon supposedly used to build his temple because he was forbidden from using iron tools.
I love his analysis of this. Velikovsky looked closely at the ancient descriptions of the Shamir.
The texts say this worm had to be kept wrapped tightly in wool and stored inside a lead box.
And the texts also say that over the centuries, the Shamir gradually lost its power to cut stone.
Right. Wool lead boxes and a gradual loss of power over time, a half-life.
Velikovsky suggested the Shamir was not a magical worm at all, but a radioactive substance used for precision stone cutting.
A remnant of advanced technological knowledge that was largely wiped out during the planetary catastrophes.
He applied this same logic to the colossal ruins of Baalbek in Lebanon.
There are foundation stones there called the trilithon, weighing over 1,000 tons each.
Quarried and moved with a precision we would struggle to replicate today.
Velikovsky argued these were not built by the Romans, as historians claim, but were relics of an ancient technological knowledge whose capabilities were erased by the very cosmic chaos he was describing.
He was taking all the fragmented anomalies, the strange myths, the impossibly large stones, the missing centuries, and fitting them into one unified, terrifyingly catastrophic theory.
But as you can imagine, a theory, this radical one that rewrites the stars in the sky, redefines the laws of physics, and deletes 800 years of the human timeline.
It did not just face polite, rigorous academic skepticism.
It faced an unprecedented, organized scientific inquisition.
Which brings us to a very dark, deeply troubling chapter in this dossier.
The establishment strikes back. We have to investigate an urgent, mysterious question.
Why did the scientific establishment go to such brutal length to silence Velikovsky?
If his theories were just crazy nonsense, why not just ignore him?
It's important for us to remain strictly impartial here. We are not taking a political side, and we are not endorsing Velikovsky's theories as absolute truth.
We are simply reporting on the historical fact of the reaction to his work.
And the reaction documented in these sources was, by all accounts, exceptionally hostile and coordinated.
The campaign of suppression was primarily led by a very powerful, very well-respected figure in astronomy, Harlow Shapley.
For context, Harlow Shapley wasn't just a random professor. He was the director of the Harvard College Observatory.
He was the man who literally measured the size of the Milky Way galaxy. He had immense institutional power.
And according to the historical records we are looking at, Shapley didn't just write a bad review of Worlds in Collision. He went on the offensive before the book was even printed.
The sources detail that Shapley organized a widespread academic boycott.
He and his colleagues successfully pressured the Macmillan Company, which had the rights to publish Worlds in Collision.
Now, Macmillan was a massive publisher, but a huge portion of their revenue came from publishing scientific textbooks for universities.
Shapley and his allies threatened to boycott Macmillan's entire textbook division if they published Velikovsky's book.
They essentially threatened the publisher with financial ruin.
And what's absolutely staggering is that they did this even though Worlds in Collision was already printed and was sitting at the #1 spot on the national bestseller lists.
It was making Macmillan a fortune.
But the academic pressure was so intense, the threat so severe, that Macmillan was forced to drop their own #1 bestseller.
And transfer the publishing rights to Doubleday, a publisher that didn't rely on university textbook sales.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to analyze the psychology of the scientific establishment.
We have to understand the prevailing scientific dogma of the 1950s. It was a concept called uniformitarianism.
This is the deeply held idea that the universe, the Earth, and biological life change only very slowly through gradual, observable processes over millions of years.
It was the absolute foundation of modern science, and it was treated almost as an untouchable religion.
Right. And Velikovsky's catastrophic timeline threatened everything in that uniformitarian temple.
It threatened Darwinian gradualism by suggesting mass extinctions happened rapidly, violently, and recently.
It threatened Newtonian mechanics by suggesting planets could electromagnetically change orbits.
And it threatened standard historical academia by deleting 800 years of the timeline.
He wasn't just attacking one discipline. He was attacking the foundations of all of them simultaneously. And the gatekeepers panicked.
The hostility didn't fade with time. It actually culminated years later, documented in the raw transcripts we have from a 1974 symposium.
Held by the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the AAAS.
They organized a panel in San Francisco specifically to debate Velikovsky.
But reading the archival transcripts, it becomes immediately clear that this was less of a rigorous scientific debate and much more of an organized showdown.
Velikovsky, who was elderly at this point, faced off against a panel of mainstream scientists, most notably a young rising star named Carl Sagan.
The transcript of that symposium is wild to read. It shows Carl Sagan using complex statistical models to try and prove that the odds of Venus and Earth colliding repeatedly were mathematically impossible.
But then Sagan resorts to open mockery.
He claims to the amusement of the audience that Velikovsky's theory predicted that frogs and mice rained down from the sky during the Venus encounters.
I want to point out the absurdity here. How did Velikovsky respond to being openly mocked by the most famous astronomer in America?
He stayed perfectly calm.
He calmly refuted Sagan using his own text. He pointed out to Sagan on the record that he never once wrote that mice fell from the sky.
And regarding the frogs, Velikovsky patiently explained that he merely suggested that the intense sudden heat from the approaching comet caused indigenous terrestrial frogs to rapidly proliferate in the warming waters.
Which perfectly aligns with the biological reality of the biblical plagues. He literally had to stand there and tell Carl Sagan you didn't even read the book correctly.
The symposium transcript highlights the profound tragedy of the entire situation.
Velikovsky had made verified, impossible predictions. like the Jupiter radio noises, the immense heat of Venus, the extent of the Earth's magnetic field.
Instead of a rigorous, open-minded testing of how he arrived at those correct predictions, the establishment often resorted to statistical misrepresentation, straw man arguments, and sheer institutional muscle to marginalize him.
So what does this all mean?
Why should you, a modern learner living today, care about an obscure, bitter debate from the 1950s between a Harvard astronomer, a psychoanalyst, and Albert Einstein?
It matters deeply because the Velikovsky affair is the ultimate documented historical case study in information filtering versus information overload.
We live in an age where we are bombarded with data from 1,000 directions every day.
But this story pulls back the curtain on how academic and institutional gatekeepers decide what information you are allowed to see.
What theories are considered acceptable to even discuss, and what ideas are burned at the academic stake.
Exactly. It's a masterclass in the necessity of critical thinking.
It teaches us to question the bedrock assumptions of our fields. Just because a mathematical model has been accepted by very smart people for centuries doesn't mean it accounts for all the variables in the universe.
The gatekeepers in the 1950s were perfectly happy with their elegant, pure gravitational mechanics, even if it meant willfully ignoring the magnetic fields of the sun or blinding themselves to the radio emissions of Jupiter.
Velikovsky's greatest contribution to humanity might not end up being his specific revised historical timeline or even his claim that Venus was a comet.
His greatest contribution was his sheer courage to follow the evidence no matter where it leads.
He reminds us that true objective science requires the willingness to cross rigid disciplinary boundaries and ask what if the foundational premise is wrong.
This has been an absolutely breathtaking journey through these files.
We started in the quiet, book-lined living room of Albert Einstein, discussing the unseen electrical forces of the cosmos.
We traveled back 3,500 years to witness the terrifying cometary fiery birth of the planet Venus.
We uncovered the hidden 800 years of human history.
And we watched the scientific establishment use every tool at its disposal to try and silence a heretic.
It serves as a powerful reminder that our universe and our history are far more dynamic than the neat, orderly models we are handed.
I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over on your own as we wrap up this deep dive.
We've seen how Immanuel Velikovsky, a single determined outsider, looked at the ancient, terrifying myths of our ancestors and successfully predicted the radio emissions of a distant planet and the staggering temperature of Venus decades before space probes could reach them.
So if he could do that, what other incredible objective truths about our universe are currently hidden in plain sight, locked away in the ancient stories we so casually dismiss as mere fairy tales?
Something to definitely think about.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll see you next time.